3 days before my daughter's funeral, I received a phone call that shattered everything I thought I understood about life, family, and trust. It was nearly midnight when my phone rang. I remember staring at the screen for several seconds before answering, because nobody calls at that hour unless something is wrong. The voice on the other end belonged to my son-in-law, Keith Brennan. He sounded calm, too calm. At the time, I told myself, people react to tragedy differently. Looking back, that was the first warning sign I ignored. Margot collapsed, he said. The doctors couldn't save her. For a moment, I couldn't process the words. My daughter Margot was 35 years old. She ran 5 miles every morning. She rarely got sick. She was the CEO of Garrison Maritime, the company I had spent most of my life building, before handing it over to her. She wasn't supposed to die. Not at 35, not without warning, not before me. Yet by sunrise, she was gone. The official explanation was sudden cardiac arrest. Tragic, unexpected, natural. At least that's what everyone said. For the next 72 hours, I moved through life like a man trapped inside a fog. Family members arrived. Employees called. Reporters reached out. Lawyers handled paperwork. Every minute felt unreal. Grief has a strange way of protecting you. It numbs your mind when reality becomes too painful to accept. That's probably why I failed to notice certain things right away, things that would later haunt me. The funeral was held on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Hundreds of people attended. Employees, investors, clients, friends, relatives, and community leaders filled every seat inside the chapel. Margot wasn't just respected, she was admired. She had transformed the company after taking over as CEO. Revenue increased. Employee retention improved. The company became stronger under her leadership than it had ever been under mine. People loved her because she earned their respect instead of demanding it. As I stood beside her casket greeting mourners, I kept hearing the same thing. She was too young. She was brilliant. This doesn't feel real. They were right. It didn't. Then I noticed Keith. At first, nothing seemed unusual. He was shaking hands and speaking with guests. A grieving husband has responsibilities during a funeral. Nobody questioned that. But the longer I watched him, the more uncomfortable I became. He wasn't talking about Margot. He wasn't sharing memories. He wasn't comforting family members. He was talking business. Constantly. Every conversation somehow drifted toward the company. The future, leadership, stability, investors, operations. At one point, I watched him spend nearly 15 minutes speaking with 2 board members, while Margot's closest friends stood nearby crying. Something about it felt wrong. My younger daughter, Leora, stayed close to him all afternoon. The 2 of them seemed to move through the crowd together. Again, I tried not to think much about it. Leora had always been close to her sister. At least that's what I wanted to believe. The truth was more complicated. Growing up, Margot excelled at everything. School, sports, leadership. People naturally gravitated toward her. Leora lived in her shadow. She never said it openly, but every parent notices things. The disappointment after another comparison. The frustration after another achievement that wasn't hers. The feeling of always being second. Even so, I never believed it had damaged their relationship permanently. Not until later. During the service, several people spoke about Margot. A longtime employee described how she paid for his daughter's medical treatment when his insurance failed. A warehouse manager spoke about how she remembered every employee's name. One board member called her the future of the company. Every story reminded me how much had been taken from us. Then Keith stepped forward. The room grew quiet. Most people expected a heartfelt tribute from a husband mourning his wife. Instead, they received something else. Keith spoke about continuity, responsibility, leadership. He spoke about protecting what Margot had built. He spoke about ensuring the company remained strong. It wasn't offensive. It wasn't inappropriate. Yet something felt missing. He talked about her legacy more than he talked about her. When he finished, the applause sounded polite rather than emotional. I wasn't the only person who noticed. After the service, several executives gathered in a reception room connected to the chapel. I stepped away for a moment to clear my head. That's when I overheard a conversation that changed everything. One of our board members approached me quietly. "How are you holding up, Eugene?" "About as well as you'd expect." He nodded sympathetically. Then he said something that immediately caught my attention. "Keith seems eager." I frowned. Eager? The man looked uncomfortable. Maybe that's the wrong word. Then what word would you use? He hesitated. Prepared. My stomach tightened. Prepared for what? The board member lowered his voice. Leadership discussions. For several seconds, I simply stared at him. What leadership discussions? The ones Keith has been having since yesterday. Yesterday. Margot had been dead for less than 24 hours. I felt a knot form in my stomach. What exactly has he been discussing? The board member glanced across the room toward Keith. Future management, board procedures, executive authority. I looked over and saw Keith laughing with a group of investors. Laughing. Not smiling politely. Laughing. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. Maybe he was trying to stay strong. Maybe grief affected people differently. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A short time later, I found another reason to worry. Our chief financial officer approached me near the refreshment table. He looked uneasy. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Of course. Did you authorize Keith to request executive reporting access? Every instinct inside me immediately sharpened. No, the CFO frowned. That's strange. Why? Because he asked my office to begin forwarding certain executive reports directly to him, starting next week. For the first time all day, grief gave way to something else. Suspicion. Margot had not even been buried yet. Yet Keith was already positioning himself as her replacement. I looked across the room again. This time, I noticed something I should have seen earlier. Keith wasn't behaving like a man who had lost the love of his life. He was behaving like a man who believed a door had just opened. A door leading toward power, money, control. Maybe I was being unfair. Maybe I was a grieving father looking for someone to blame. But as I watched him smiling beside Leora, speaking confidently with board members while my daughter's casket sat only a few yards away, one thought entered my mind and refused to leave. What if Margot's death wasn't the beginning of Keith's nightmare? What if it was exactly what he had been waiting for? The morning after Margot's funeral, I arrived at Garrison Maritime before sunrise. For nearly 40 years, that building had been my second home. I knew every hallway, every office, every conference room. Yet that morning felt different. The place seemed quieter, heavier. People were grieving. Employees spoke in hushed voices. Several stopped me to offer condolences. Others simply nodded. Everyone was trying to process the same impossible reality. Margot was gone. I expected the company to spend a few days mourning before discussing leadership. That would have been normal. That would have been human. Unfortunately, Keith Brennan had other plans. Less than an hour after I arrived, I received a message from the executive assistant. Keith had scheduled a senior management meeting. Not next week, not after the funeral period. That morning, I felt irritation immediately. Margot had been buried less than 24 hours earlier. The company wasn't collapsing. There was no emergency, no crisis, no reason to rush. Yet when I entered the boardroom, Keith was already standing at the front of the table. He looked confident, comfortable, prepared. Several executives exchanged uneasy glances as I took my seat. Keith smiled politely. "Thank you all for coming." Nobody responded. He continued anyway. "I know we're all dealing with an enormous loss." For a brief moment, I thought he might actually focus on Margot. Instead, he immediately shifted topics. The company needs stability. There it was again. Stability, leadership, continuity, the same words he repeated throughout the funeral. Keith spent the next 20 minutes discussing operational priorities, investor confidence, executive reporting structures, and management responsibilities. At one point, he even referred to future strategic decisions as though they were already his to make. Several executives looked uncomfortable. Others seemed shocked. I wasn't surprised. They had worked with Margot for years. Watching her husband position himself as her successor before anyone had time to grieve felt wrong. Then Keith made his first major mistake. "Until a permanent leadership arrangement is finalized," he said, "I'll be coordinating executive decisions." Silence filled the room. Finally, our CFO cleared his throat. "Who authorized that?" Keith's smile faded slightly. "It's the most practical solution." The CFO didn't look convinced. Neither did anyone else, because everyone in the room understood one important fact. Keith didn't work for the company. He wasn't an executive. He wasn't a board member. He wasn't even involved in daily operations. He happened to be married to the CEO, that was all. Yet somehow he was already talking like he owned the place. After the meeting ended, several executives remained behind. Nobody wanted to say much while Keith was present. Once he left, however, the atmosphere changed immediately. "What the hell was that?" one vice president asked. Nobody answered because everyone was thinking the same thing. The CFO finally looked toward me. "Did Margot ever discuss succession plans?" "Yes." "And?" I studied their faces carefully. Keith wasn't part of them. The room fell silent. That answer seemed to confirm what everyone already suspected. Something wasn't right. Later that afternoon, I received another surprise. A family attorney called my office. His tone sounded unusually cautious. "Eugene, I wanted to verify something." "What is it?" "Has Keith contacted you regarding the estate?" My stomach tightened. "No." The attorney hesitated. "Interesting. Why?" "Because he contacted me yesterday." "Yesterday? The day of the funeral?" I leaned back in my chair. What did he want? Information regarding inheritance procedures. My jaw tightened immediately. Margot hadn't even been buried yet. "I know." The attorney sounded uncomfortable. "That's why I called." According to him, Keith's questions weren't emotional. They weren't practical. They were financial. He wanted timelines, asset transfers, trust structures, insurance processing, distribution schedules. The attorney found the conversation disturbing enough to document it. By the time the call ended, my concerns had grown significantly. Still, concern wasn't evidence. Suspicion wasn't proof. I kept reminding myself of that. Then something happened that I couldn't ignore. Around 5 o'clock, I walked past Margot's executive office. The door was open. That alone felt strange. Usually the office remained secured when vacant. As I approached, I saw someone inside. Keith. He wasn't sitting in a visitor chair. He wasn't collecting personal belongings. He was sitting behind Margot's desk, her desk, looking through documents, reviewing files, acting as though the office already belonged to him. For several seconds, I simply stood there. He didn't notice me immediately. When he finally looked up, he seemed surprised. Not guilty, not embarrassed, just surprised. "Eugene." His voice sounded casual, too casual. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Trying to help." I glanced around the room. "By going through her office?" Keith stood. "The company still needs leadership." There was that word again. Leadership. I was beginning to hate it. "The company needs time," I replied. For a brief moment, something flashed across his face. Irritation. It disappeared almost instantly. But I saw it. Then Keith smiled. Of course. Yet the smile never reached his eyes. That evening, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. Every event by itself seemed explainable. Together, however, they formed a troubling pattern. The funeral conversations, the inheritance questions, the executive meeting, the office. The urgency. Everything pointed toward the same conclusion. Keith wasn't grieving Margot. He was moving past her, fast. 2 days later, that suspicion took another step toward becoming something far more serious. I received a call from a young manager named Daniel Oakes. Daniel worked in the compliance department, smart, quiet, respected. He wasn't the type of person who created drama. In fact, most executives barely noticed him, which is why his request immediately caught my attention. "Mr. Garrison," he said, "I need to speak with you." "About what?" Several seconds passed. Then Daniel lowered his voice. "About Margot." Every instinct inside me sharpened immediately. "What about her?" Another pause followed, longer this time. When he finally spoke again, his voice sounded nervous, almost frightened. Not over the phone. My pulse accelerated. "Daniel, what's going on?" His answer changed everything. "I think Margot discovered something before she died." Then he added the sentence that would pull me into the darkest chapter of my life. "And I don't think her death was as simple as everyone believes." Daniel Oakes chose a diner 2 blocks from the harbor because, in his words, nobody important ever ate there. He was right. The place smelled like burnt coffee and frying oil, the kind of place where dock workers came before dawn and retired men sat for hours pretending they were only there for breakfast. I arrived 10 minutes early and chose a booth facing the door. Daniel arrived exactly on time, wearing a gray coat, carrying a worn leather folder, and looking like a man who had checked behind him more than once before entering. That was the first thing I noticed. Not his nervousness, his caution. Daniel wasn't dramatic. He wasn't emotional. He worked in compliance, which meant he noticed details other people ignored. Margot liked him for that. She once told me he had the rare ability to make boring information dangerous. When he sat across from me, he didn't order food. He asked for black coffee and kept both hands around the mug without drinking. "Thank you for coming," he said. "You sounded worried." "I am." He glanced toward the windows, then back at me. "I don't know who else I can trust." That sentence made the hair on the back of my neck rise. Start from the beginning. Daniel opened the folder but didn't hand me anything yet. About 5 months ago, Margot asked me to review several vendor accounts. Routine audit? He shook his head. Not exactly. She said something felt wrong. Small payments were being approved too quickly, usually through contractors connected to special logistics consulting. Nothing huge. Nothing that would set off automatic alarms, but enough to bother her. I listened without interrupting. At first I thought it was clerical, Daniel continued. Duplicate invoices, poor review procedures, maybe careless approvals. Then I started comparing account numbers, mailing addresses, and tax filings. Some vendors were real companies on paper, but they had no real staff, no real office, and no legitimate history with shipping compliance. Shell companies, I said. Daniel nodded. That was my conclusion. The words settled between us like a weight. Fraud was ugly, but fraud inside a family company was personal. How much money? I asked. That depends on how far back it goes. He finally slid one document across the table. What I can prove right now is just over $400,000 spread across 26 payments. I stared at the numbers. Not enough to destroy the company, enough to hide, enough to test the system, enough to grow if nobody stopped it. Who approved them? Daniel hesitated. That hesitation told me I wasn't going to like the answer. Most approvals were routed through secondary authority credentials. Whose? Keith Brennan's. For a moment, the diner noise seemed to fade. I looked down at the document again, hoping I had misunderstood. I hadn't. Keith's name appeared beside transaction approvals, vendor authorizations, and revised payment requests. Keith doesn't have operational authority, I said. He shouldn't. Daniel's voice stayed quiet. But someone granted him access. That was worse. Keith using unauthorized access was one thing. Someone inside the company helping him obtain it was another. Did Margot know? I asked. Daniel's expression changed. Not fear exactly. Sadness. Yes. The word hit me harder than I expected. When? About 2 weeks before she died. He pulled another sheet from the folder. This one was a printed email. I recognized Margot's communication style immediately. Short, direct, precise. Daniel had sent her a summary of the suspicious transactions, and Margot had replied less than 15 minutes later. Do not discuss this with anyone else. Keep collecting clean evidence. We will meet privately. I read the message twice, then a third time. My daughter had known. She had been investigating her own husband. Did they meet? I asked. Daniel looked down at his coffee. Yes. When? The next morning. What happened? I wasn't in the room, but Margot called me afterward. His voice tightened. She sounded angry. Not scared. Angry. That sounded like Margot. Fear made her sharper. Anger made her dangerous. What did she say? Daniel looked directly at me. She said Keith lied to her face. My jaw tightened. Daniel continued. She said he denied everything, then accused her of turning the company against him. She told me she was going to bring the evidence to the board if he didn't explain the access records. And after that, things changed. He reached into the folder again and removed several photographs. They weren't professional, just images taken from a phone. One showed Keith entering a private office building downtown. Another showed him meeting with an attorney I didn't recognize. A third showed him in a parking garage speaking to someone inside a black SUV. You followed him? I asked. Daniel looked embarrassed but didn't apologize. After Margot died, yes. Why? Because I didn't believe the timing. He said it so plainly that I felt something cold move through me. You think Keith had something to do with her death? I think Margot was about to expose him, and then she died suddenly. He paused. That is the kind of timing compliance officers are trained not to ignore. I wanted to reject it. I wanted to tell him grief was making both of us see monsters in shadows, but I couldn't. Not after the funeral, not after the executive meeting, not after Keith sitting behind Margot's desk. "Why come to me now?" I asked. Daniel's answer came immediately. "Because I think someone is cleaning up." He showed me another document. Several files Margot had requested before her death were now missing from the internal archive. Not moved, not restricted, deleted. Whoever removed them had used administrative credentials. Daniel had preserved copies of some documents, but not all. "Who has that level of access?" I asked. "Only a few people." "Keith?" "Not directly." "Then who?" Daniel didn't answer right away. Instead, he closed the folder halfway, as if deciding whether to say the next part. "There's another name in the records." I felt my stomach tighten. "Whose name?" "I need more proof before I say it." "Daniel." My voice hardened. "If you think my daughter was killed, you don't get to protect anyone's feelings." He swallowed. "I'm not protecting feelings. I'm protecting the investigation. If I'm wrong, I could destroy an innocent person. If I'm right, then Keith isn't the only problem." The way he said it told me the second name was close. Too close. Before I could press him further, Daniel looked toward the diner window. His entire body changed. He lowered his voice. "Don't turn around." Every instinct in me wanted to look. I didn't. "What is it?" "Black SUV across the street." My pulse accelerated. "You recognize it?" "It's been outside my apartment twice this week." The diner suddenly felt smaller. The noise around us felt too loud. Daniel slid the folder back into his coat. "I shouldn't have stayed this long. Give me the documents." "Not yet. Daniel, if you're in danger, don't walk out of here with the only proof." He looked at me then, and for the first time I saw how frightened he really was. "I made copies. If something happens, they'll get to you." "What does that mean?" He stood before answering. "It means Margot was right to be careful." Then he placed a folded receipt on the table and tapped it once with his finger. "Read that after I leave." I watched him walk out of the diner, shoulders tense, head slightly lowered against the wind. He didn't look back. I waited until he disappeared around the corner before unfolding the receipt. On the back, written in Daniel's small, neat handwriting, was a single sentence. She was about to expose someone in the family. I sat there staring at those words, while the coffee went cold in front of me. Keith was bad enough. Keith was an outsider who married into our family and wanted what Margot had built. But someone in the family meant something worse. It meant blood. It meant betrayal from inside the house. And as I looked through the diner window, at the empty curb where the black SUV had been parked only minutes earlier, I realized Daniel hadn't just warned me about fraud. He had warned me that my daughter's death might have started with someone she trusted. For the next 2 days, I couldn't stop thinking about Daniel's note. She was about to expose someone in the family. Those 8 words followed me everywhere. During meetings, during meals, even at night when I tried to sleep. At first, I convinced myself Daniel meant Keith. After all, Keith technically was family. He married Margot. Maybe that was all Daniel meant. But the more I replayed our conversation, the less I believed it. If Daniel wanted to warn me about Keith, he would have written Keith's name. Instead, he chose a far more dangerous phrase. Someone in the family. Someone close enough to make him hesitate. Someone important enough that he wanted more proof before saying it aloud. On the 3rd morning, Daniel called again. His voice sounded strained, tired, like someone who hadn't slept. "We need to meet." "Where?" I asked. "Not the diner." "Why?" A pause followed. "Because I think someone followed me there." My stomach tightened. We agreed to meet inside a small public library, 20 minutes outside Baltimore. Quiet, safe, cameras everywhere. When I arrived, Daniel was already waiting in a private study room. This time, he looked worse than before. Dark circles under his eyes, unshaven, constantly checking the hallway through the glass door. He immediately placed a thick folder on the table. "I have enough proof now." The tension in his voice made my pulse quicken. "Proof of what?" Daniel opened the folder. "The second name." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he turned the first page toward me. I looked down. My heart nearly stopped. The name printed across the authorization record was Leora Garrison, my daughter, Margot's younger sister. I stared at the document for several moments, waiting for my brain to reject it. It didn't. The signature matched. The approval codes matched. The timestamps matched. Leora had authorized multiple vendor relationships connected to the shell companies Daniel had discovered. No. The word escaped before I could stop it. Daniel remained silent. There has to be another explanation. I thought so too. Leora doesn't work in finance. She doesn't have to. Daniel slid another document across the table. She works in business development. She can recommend vendors. I looked at the page, then another, then another. Every record placed Leora closer to the fraud scheme than I wanted to believe. Not at the center, but close enough to matter. How many times? I asked quietly. 7 confirmed approvals. 7. Not one mistake, not one accident. 7 separate decisions. I leaned back in my chair, trying to process what I was seeing. Memories flooded my mind. Birthday parties, family vacations, holidays, the girls growing up together, Margot helping Leora with school projects. Leora standing beside Margot at graduations and celebrations. None of it matched the document sitting in front of me. Daniel must have seen the conflict on my face because his expression softened slightly. I don't think she started this. What do you mean? I think Keith did. I looked up. Daniel continued carefully. But Leora benefited from it. The room fell silent again. That explanation felt more believable. Not because it made the situation better, because it fit human nature. Keith was ambitious, manipulative, opportunistic. Leora had spent most of her life standing behind a sister everyone admired. Together, those weaknesses could become dangerous. Then Daniel showed me something worse. A series of internal messages recovered from archived communication logs. Most were ordinary business conversations. One wasn't. The exchange occurred 3 weeks before Margot died. Leora had written to Keith late at night. Did you talk to her? Keith replied minutes later. Not yet. Then came another message. You need to fix this before she ruins everything. I read the sentence twice, then a third time. Who is she talking about? I asked. Daniel's answer came immediately. Margot. My chest tightened. The conversation continued. Leora expressed concern that Margot was reviewing certain contracts. Keith assured her everything was under control. Nothing in the messages directly mentioned fraud, yet the meaning felt obvious. They were worried about what Margot was discovering, very worried. Then Daniel handed me the final document. This is the one that convinced me. It was a calendar entry. Margot had scheduled a private meeting with Keith 6 days before her death. The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours. No notes were attached. No minutes were recorded. No witnesses attended. How do you know it matters? I asked. Daniel slid another page beside it. The second document was an email sent by Margot less than an hour after the meeting ended. She had written it to herself, a habit many executives use to document important events. The message contained only one sentence. My stomach dropped the moment I read it. Keith lied. Leora knows more than she's admitting. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Margot had reached the same conclusion Daniel had. Before she died, before any of us knew what was happening, she already suspected both of them. The realization felt like a punch to the chest. Daniel closed the folder slowly. She was getting close. I nodded. Too close. That's what scares me. His voice had become quieter now, more serious. People commit fraud all the time. Most don't end up dead. The words hung heavily between us. Because he was right. Financial crimes rarely ended with funerals. Yet here we were, a dead CEO, missing records, suspicious approvals, and a growing list of people with motives. Then Daniel reached into his jacket and removed a flash drive. Small, black, ordinary. He placed it carefully on the table. What's on this? I asked. Everything I've collected. Give it to the police. Daniel shook his head. Not yet. Why? Because I don't know who I can trust. That answer bothered me more than anything else he had said. Daniel wasn't paranoid. He was methodical. If he distrusted the situation this much, there was a reason. Then his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. Every trace of color disappeared from his face. What is it? I asked. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood. I have to go. Daniel. Not now. His voice sounded different, sharper, urgent. Something's wrong. He shoved the flash drive back into his pocket. Call me tonight? Who texted you? He looked toward the study room door before answering. I don't know. The response made no sense. Then I realized what he meant. The number wasn't familiar. Yet whoever sent the message knew enough to frighten him. Daniel started toward the exit, then stopped. For a moment, he seemed to debate whether to say something else. Finally, he turned back toward me. If anything happens to me, don't trust Keith. He paused. And don't trust Leora either. Then he left. I watched him disappear down the hallway without looking back. Something about the way he walked told me he believed he was running out of time. As I sat alone in the study room, staring at the documents spread across the table, one terrible realization settled into my mind. This was no longer a question of whether Margot had discovered fraud. She had. The real question was how much she had discovered before she died, and whether that knowledge had gotten her killed. I expected Daniel to call that night. He didn't. At first, I told myself he was being cautious. Maybe he wanted to make sure he wasn't being followed. Maybe he was organizing more evidence before contacting me again. Daniel wasn't reckless. Everything he did was deliberate. When midnight came and went without a call, I became concerned. By the following morning, concern had turned into something else. I called him 3 times. No answer. I sent a message. No response. By lunchtime, I drove to his apartment. His car was gone. The blinds were closed. Nobody answered the door. It wasn't enough to panic. Not yet. People have lives. People travel. People get busy. But after everything Daniel had told me, every silence felt louder than it should have. That evening, I received a call from our chief financial officer. His voice sounded strained. You should come to the office. Why? Because something happened. 20 minutes later, I was sitting in Margot's old conference room. The CFO wasn't alone. 2 compliance employees sat beside him. Both looked nervous. The moment I entered, I knew this wasn't about normal business. What's going on? I asked. The CFO exchanged a glance with the others. Daniel's account was accessed last night. My stomach tightened immediately. By Daniel? We don't think so. He turned his laptop toward me. Security logs filled the screen. Several folders connected to Daniel's compliance review had been opened shortly after midnight. Files were copied. Others were deleted. Administrative privileges had been used. The activity lasted less than 20 minutes. Then everything stopped. Can you recover the files? I asked. Some? The CFO hesitated. Not all. I stared at the screen. Somebody wasn't just hiding evidence anymore. Somebody was actively destroying it. Then another detail caught my attention. Where was the access request routed? The CFO zoomed in on the log information. Executive administration credentials. My pulse quickened. Whose credentials? Silence filled the room. Finally, he answered. The request originated from an account assigned to Keith Brennan. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Technically, it didn't prove Keith himself logged in. Credentials could be stolen. Passwords could be shared. But after everything Daniel had uncovered, the coincidence felt impossible to ignore. Then, the compliance manager spoke. There's something else. He handed me a printed email. The message had been sent by Margot 8 days before her death. Addressed to Daniel. Subject line, meeting follow-up. I immediately recognized her writing style. The message was short but direct. I spoke with Keith today. He denied everything. Continue gathering documentation. Do not discuss this investigation with anyone, including family members, until we have enough evidence. Family members. The phrase hit me immediately. Margot wasn't worried only about Keith. She was worried about someone else, someone close, someone she didn't fully trust anymore. Then I noticed the attachment listed beneath the email. A document called Executive Review Summary. Where's the attachment? I asked. The compliance manager looked uncomfortable. Missing. Deleted? He nodded. Sometime after Margot died. Every answer seemed to create 2 new questions. Before I could say anything else, my phone vibrated. Unknown number. Normally, I would have ignored it. Something told me not to. Hello? Several seconds of silence followed. Then a voice spoke. Quiet. Nervous. Male. Mr. Garrison? My heartbeat accelerated immediately. Daniel, listen carefully. Relief and fear hit me at the same time. He was alive, but something was wrong. Very wrong. His breathing sounded uneven, like he was speaking while moving. Where are you? I asked. I don't have much time. Daniel, where are you? Another pause. Then his voice dropped even lower. Margot met Keith the week before she died. I know. No. His tone sharpened. You don't understand. Every instinct inside me activated. Then tell me. I heard a door close somewhere in the background. Then footsteps. Fast footsteps. Daniel continued speaking. The argument wasn't about money. My stomach tightened. What was it about? Silence. Then, she found out what Keith was planning. I stood from my chair immediately. Planning what? The answer never came. Instead, I heard a sudden crash. Then another voice. Not Daniel's. The line filled with noise. Shouting. Movement. Something falling. Daniel, I shouted. Daniel. The connection remained open for several seconds, long enough to hear what sounded like a struggle. Then the call ended. My hand tightened around the phone. The room stared at me. Nobody needed an explanation. They could see it on my face. Something terrible had just happened. I called back immediately. Straight to voicemail. Again. Voicemail. Again. Same result. Within minutes, Detective Marcus Reed, from Baltimore Homicide, was involved. I gave him everything. The phone number, the timing, the conversation, the interrupted call. Reed listened carefully. Then he asked a question I hadn't considered. Did Daniel say where he was? No. Did he mention anyone by name? No. Reed was silent for a moment. But he sounded afraid, terrified. Reed didn't try to reassure me. He didn't say Daniel was probably fine. He didn't offer comforting theories. That worried me more than anything else. Experienced detectives know when situations feel wrong. This situation felt wrong. The next morning, things became worse. Daniel didn't show up for work. Human resources couldn't reach him. Neither could his landlord. Neither could his sister. By noon, police officially classified him as a missing person. Then, another discovery changed everything. Investigators obtained security footage from the parking garage near Daniel's apartment. The footage showed Daniel leaving the building shortly before the phone call. He appeared nervous. He looked over his shoulder multiple times. Then a black SUV entered the garage. The same type of vehicle Daniel mentioned during our first meeting. My pulse spiked when Reed showed me the footage. Daniel wasn't imagining things. Someone had been watching him. Someone had been following him. The video continued. Daniel reached his car. The SUV stopped nearby. Then the camera angle lost sight of both vehicles. 4 minutes later, the SUV exited the garage. Daniel's car never did. Reed paused the footage. Neither of us spoke for several seconds, because we both understood what it meant. Daniel hadn't disappeared voluntarily. Then Reed's phone rang. He answered immediately. His expression changed before the conversation ended. What happened? I asked. Reed slowly lowered the phone. The look in his eyes told me the answer before he spoke. We found Daniel's car. My stomach dropped. Where? Abandoned near the harbor. Silence filled the room. Then Reed delivered the sentence I had been dreading since the moment Daniel failed to answer my calls. And based on what we found inside, this is no longer a missing person investigation. My pulse hammered in my ears. What is it now? Reed looked directly at me. A potential homicide. When Detective Reed told me Daniel's disappearance was now being treated as a potential homicide, the last piece of doubt I had been holding on to finally disappeared. For days, I had been trying to convince myself there was another explanation. Maybe Daniel had panicked. Maybe he had gone into hiding. Maybe he was protecting himself. But deep down, I already knew the truth. Daniel had been getting too close to something dangerous. And now he was gone. The following morning, Reed invited me to police headquarters. His tone over the phone told me this wasn't a routine update. Something had happened. When I arrived, several detectives were gathered around a conference table covered with photographs. Reed looked exhausted. He had probably been awake all night. What did you find? I asked. He slid a photograph toward me. It showed the interior of Daniel's abandoned car. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. Then I noticed the dark stain on the driver's seat. My stomach tightened. Is that blood? Reed nodded, confirmed. The room suddenly felt colder. Daniel hadn't simply vanished. Violence had occurred inside that vehicle. Reed handed me another photograph. This one showed Daniel's cell phone recovered from a trash container less than a mile away. The device had been smashed repeatedly, not dropped, Not damaged accidentally, destroyed. Someone wanted to make sure whatever was inside would never be seen again. Unfortunately for them, forensic specialists had already recovered part of its contents. Reed opened a file. Daniel wasn't just investigating financial fraud. My pulse quickened. What do you mean? Reed turned the screen toward me. Several messages appeared. They had been exchanged between Daniel and Margot during the final 2 weeks of her life. Most discussed vendor payments and suspicious approvals. Then one message changed everything. Margot had written, "The money is important, but it isn't the real problem anymore." Reed tapped the screen. Read the next message. Daniel's reply appeared below. "You think Keith is planning something?" Margot's answer came 6 minutes later. "I think he's becoming desperate." The room fell silent. Desperate people are dangerous, especially when they believe they're about to lose everything. Reed continued. "There's more." He opened another recovered file. This one contained notes Daniel had written for himself, personal observations, investigation summaries. The final entry was dated the day before he disappeared. I felt my pulse accelerate as Reed read it aloud. "Keith isn't acting alone. Someone inside the family is helping him. Margot knows it. I think she's preparing to expose both of them. Family. Again, not company. Family." Daniel had reached the same conclusion before vanishing. Reed closed the file. Whatever they were hiding, Daniel was getting very close. That afternoon, investigators discovered something else. Security footage from a gas station located near the harbor showed Daniel's vehicle entering the area shortly before midnight. A black SUV appeared less than 3 minutes later. The same type of vehicle witnesses had reported seeing near Daniel's apartment multiple times. This time, however, detectives managed to identify the license plate. The SUV had been rented under a false identity. Normally, that would have created another dead end, except the rental office possessed security footage. Reed showed me still photographs taken from the rental counter. The man renting the vehicle wore a baseball cap and sunglasses. He clearly wanted to avoid identification. Unfortunately for him, cameras captured enough of his face for investigators to make a comparison. The match wasn't perfect, but it was close enough to concern detectives. The individual resembled a former private security contractor who now worked for a consulting company connected to one of the shell vendors Daniel had been investigating. The conspiracy was growing larger, more organized, more dangerous. Then Reed asked a question I hadn't considered. "Why do you think Daniel came to you?" I frowned. "Because he trusted me." Reed shook his head. "That's only part of it." He leaned forward. He also expected something to happen. The realization hit me immediately. Daniel had made copies. Daniel had documented everything. Daniel had warned me repeatedly. He hadn't been acting like a man building a routine fraud case. He had been acting like a man preparing for the possibility that he wouldn't survive long enough to finish it. Reed nodded when I shared the thought. Exactly. The more we reviewed Daniel's actions, the clearer the pattern became. Backup files, duplicate records, hidden notes, separate storage locations. He had spent weeks building safeguards. He knew he was being watched. He knew he was being followed. Yet he continued anyway. For the first time since this investigation began, I realized how much courage that required. Most people would have walked away. Daniel moved forward. And now he had paid for it. Late that evening, another breakthrough arrived. A forensic accountant reviewing company records discovered that one of the fraudulent vendor accounts received a substantial payment only 48 hours after Margot died. The amount wasn't enormous, $58,000. What mattered was the timing. The account had remained inactive for months. Then suddenly, money moved immediately after her death. Reed studied the transfer report carefully. Someone thought the danger was gone. I knew exactly what he meant. Whoever controlled the scheme believed Margot could no longer expose them, which meant her death wasn't merely convenient. It solved a problem. The next morning, detectives executed a search warrant on several company servers. Most of the deleted files remained unrecoverable. One didn't. Hidden deep within an archived backup folder, investigators located a calendar entry created by Margot 6 days before she died. The title consisted of only 3 words: Final Evidence Review. Attached beneath it was a list of attendees: Margot, Daniel, Keith Brennan. I stared at the screen. She was confronting him. Reed nodded. Looks that way. My stomach tightened. If Margot planned to confront Keith with evidence, then he had known exactly how much danger he was in. He knew she was investigating. He knew Daniel was helping. He knew exposure was coming. Suddenly, motive wasn't difficult to see anymore. Then Reed's phone rang. He listened for several seconds before standing up immediately. Every detective in the room looked toward him. "What happened?" someone asked. Reed ended the call and looked directly at me. His expression told me the answer before he spoke. "We found Daniel." Relief surged through me for a fraction of a second. Then I saw Reed's face. The relief disappeared instantly. "Where?" I asked quietly. Reed took a slow breath. "Inside an abandoned warehouse near the harbor." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Because everyone already knew what came next. Reed lowered his voice. "He's dead." The room fell completely silent. Daniel Oakes had spent weeks trying to protect the truth. He had warned Margot. He had warned me. He had left evidence behind because he knew he was in danger. And now he was gone. But as devastating as the news was, Reed wasn't finished. He placed a newly recovered evidence photograph on the table. My eyes immediately moved to the highlighted section, found in Daniel's jacket pocket. A folded, handwritten note. 3 words. "Keith did it." For a long time after Detective Reed told me Daniel was dead, I couldn't say a word. I just stared at the photograph sitting on the conference table. Daniel Oakes was 31 years old. He wasn't a police officer. He wasn't a prosecutor. He wasn't a politician exposing corruption. He was a compliance manager who believed rules mattered. A man who could have looked the other way and protected himself. Instead, he chose to keep digging. Now he was dead because of it. Reed gave me a few moments before continuing. "The medical examiner believes he was killed within hours of the phone call you received." My jaw tightened. I remembered every second of that call. Daniel trying to warn me. Daniel sounding terrified. Daniel telling me Margot had discovered something bigger than financial fraud. Then the struggle. The crash. The silence. Reed slid another report across the table. "There are signs he fought back." That detail mattered more than I expected. Daniel hadn't gone quietly. He hadn't simply disappeared. He had resisted. He had tried to survive. Unfortunately, whoever took him had been prepared. As difficult as the news was, the investigation didn't stop. In fact, Daniel's death transformed everything. What had started as a financial inquiry was now a murder investigation. Detectives gained access to warrants they couldn't obtain before. Financial records expanded. Communication logs expanded. Digital evidence expanded. People who previously refused to cooperate suddenly became much more willing to talk. Murder changes priorities. 2 days later, investigators completed a detailed review of Daniel's files. They discovered something important. Daniel hadn't merely tracked suspicious payments, he had mapped them. Every shell company, every transfer, every approval, every connection. The deeper analysts examined his work, the clearer the pattern became. Money flowed through multiple fake vendors before eventually reaching accounts controlled by a small network of beneficiaries. At the center of that network sat Keith Brennan, not alone, but at the center. Reed called me that evening. "We've confirmed more than $700,000 in fraudulent transactions." My stomach tightened. "Can you prove Keith received it?" "Some of it." "How much?" "Enough." For the first time since Margot died, investigators weren't dealing with theories. They were dealing with evidence, real evidence. Bank records don't care about excuses. Numbers tell their own story. Unfortunately, the financial records also confirmed something else. Leora's involvement was deeper than anyone wanted to believe. Several vendor approvals originated from her department. Others contained her electronic authorization. She wasn't running the scheme. That much remained clear. But she had helped it function. The realization hurt more than I expected. Losing Margot was devastating. Discovering one daughter may have helped the people responsible, made it worse. Much worse. Then Reed delivered another surprise. "We interviewed several employees today. And apparently Keith wasn't as careful as he thought." My pulse quickened. Reed explained that after Margot's funeral, Keith became increasingly arrogant around certain staff members. He spoke openly about future leadership, future ownership, future authority. One employee even reported hearing Keith say something that immediately caught investigators' attention. What did he say? Reed checked his notes. "People spend too much time looking backward." Winners focus on what's next. The statement by itself wasn't criminal, but the timing was disturbing. Margot had been dead for less than a week. Most people were grieving. Keith was talking about winning. The more witnesses investigators interviewed, the clearer a picture emerged. Keith wasn't acting like a devastated husband. He was acting like a man who believed he had finally achieved something important. Then another witness came forward, a senior executive who attended a private dinner with Keith several weeks before Margot died. According to the executive, Keith spent most of the evening complaining about Margot, about the company, about being overlooked. One statement stood out above all the others. "Everyone treats her like she's irreplaceable." Reed read the quote aloud. Then he looked at me. Neither of us needed to discuss its significance. That wasn't how loving husbands described their wives. That was how resentful rivals described competitors. The next major breakthrough arrived through an unexpected source: Margot's personal attorney. While reviewing estate records, the attorney discovered a document created 3 months before her death. The document wasn't a will, it wasn't a trust. It was a confidential memorandum. Margot had prepared it after becoming concerned about irregular activity inside the company. The memorandum listed several concerns: unauthorized access requests, suspicious contracts, internal pressure from Keith. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "If these issues continue, I may need to remove Keith from all company-related activities." I read the line twice, then a third time. Reed immediately understood its importance. If Keith knew Margot planned to remove him from company operations, his situation was far worse than we originally thought. Not only was she investigating him, she was preparing to cut him off completely. The motive suddenly became stronger, more personal, more urgent. Then came the insurance policy. Investigators finally obtained records from the insurance carrier. Margot's life insurance policy totaled $5 million. Keith was the primary beneficiary. What mattered wasn't the amount. What mattered was Keith's behavior afterward. 48 hours after Margot died, he contacted the insurance company, not to ask questions about grief counseling, not to discuss funeral expenses, to discuss payment timelines. Reed showed me the records personally. He wanted to know how quickly the funds could be released. I felt physically sick. Margot wasn't even buried when he started planning for the money. If I already disliked Keith before, that feeling was rapidly becoming hatred. Then Reed asked a question that neither of us had fully considered. Why didn't Daniel go directly to federal authorities? I frowned. I don't know. Reed nodded slowly. We think we do. Investigators had recovered additional notes from Daniel's computer. Several entries referenced the same concern. Daniel feared presenting incomplete evidence. He believed Keith would destroy records before prosecutors could act. That's why he continued gathering documentation. That's why he kept building the case. He wasn't being reckless. He was trying to make sure nobody escaped. Tragically, it cost him his life. 3 days later, Daniel's funeral was held. The turnout surprised everyone. Employees, friends, family, former co-workers. People filled the chapel. Daniel wasn't famous. He wasn't wealthy. But he was respected. And respect lasts longer than money. I stood beside his sister during the service. She cried through most of it. When the ceremony ended, she handed me something. "Daniel wanted you to have this if anything happened." My pulse immediately accelerated. The item was a sealed envelope. My name was written on the front in Daniel's handwriting. For several seconds, I simply stared at it. Daniel had known. Somehow, he had known the danger was real. That evening, I opened the envelope at home. Inside was a single flash drive and a handwritten note. The note was short. Typical Daniel. Direct, organized, precise. If you're reading this, I wasn't able to finish. Follow the money, then follow Keith. I turned the flash drive over in my hand. The entire investigation had already changed because of Daniel's evidence. Yet something told me this drive contained the most important piece of all, because Daniel knew he might die. And people facing that reality tend to protect only what matters most. Whatever was hidden inside that drive was important enough to risk everything for. And somewhere out there, Keith Brennan still believed he had gotten away with murder. He was wrong. The truth was finally starting to catch up to him. Daniel's flash drive sat on my kitchen table for almost an hour before I touched it. That probably sounds strange. After everything that had happened, you would think I would have plugged it in immediately. But there was something terrifying about holding a dead man's final evidence in your hand. Once we opened it, there would be no going back. No more suspicion. No more hoping there had been a misunderstanding. No more pretending Keith was simply greedy instead of dangerous. Lyle arrived just after 7 that evening, with a clean laptop he kept for sensitive legal work. No company network, no cloud sync, no automatic backups. If Daniel was careful, he said, placing the computer on the table, we should be careful too. He was right. Daniel had died because he knew too much. I wasn't going to disrespect him by being careless with what he left behind. The flash drive contained 4 folders: financial records, insurance, medical, personal notes. We opened the financial folder first. Most of it confirmed what detectives already suspected: fake vendors, inflated invoices, repeated approvals, money routed through layers of accounts before landing in places connected to Keith. But Daniel had done something brilliant. He had not only documented the fraud, he had explained it. Every spreadsheet included notes in plain English: who approved what, why the payment looked suspicious, which vendor had no legitimate business activity, which account eventually received the money. Daniel knew prosecutors would need more than numbers. He built them a roadmap. Then we opened the insurance folder. My stomach tightened before the first file even loaded. Margot's life insurance policy appeared on the screen. $5 million. Keith Brennan, primary beneficiary. That part we already knew. What we didn't know was that Keith had requested a copy of the policy 6 weeks before Margot died. Not after. Before. The request had been routed through an insurance broker using Keith's personal email. Lyle leaned closer to the screen. 6 weeks before? I nodded slowly. He was preparing. The next document made it worse. Daniel had obtained call logs from the insurance company. Keith contacted them twice before Margot's death. The first call involved beneficiary confirmation. The second involved claim requirements after sudden death. Sudden death. My hands went cold. People don't ask those questions unless they're planning for something, I said. Lyle didn't answer. He didn't need to. The evidence spoke clearly enough. Then we opened a note Daniel had attached to the folder. It was short, written like a warning to whoever found it after him. Keith is not reacting to Margot's death. He is preparing for it. I read that sentence 3 times. Each time, the meaning became uglier. Keith hadn't simply moved quickly after my daughter's death. He had been waiting. He had been preparing documents, studying insurance rules, and positioning himself before Margot ever collapsed. The grief I saw at the funeral had been theater. The handshakes, the speeches, the talk about stability, all of it had been part of the next step. The real shock came in the medical folder. At first, there were only copies of hospital documents we had already seen. Emergency intake records, preliminary cardiac notes, death certification paperwork. Then Lyle found a file labeled discrepancy log. Daniel had created it after comparing different versions of Margot's medical documents. He had found something disturbing. The earliest version of her emergency intake record mentioned symptoms that did not fit a simple cardiac event: severe abdominal pain, dizziness, numbness in fingers, confusion, vomiting. Those details appeared in the first draft. They were missing from the final record. I looked at Lyle. Can records change like that? He frowned. Corrections happen, but symptoms disappearing from a final chart? That's not normal. Daniel's note under the file was even clearer. Final record appears sanitized. Need toxicology review. Toxicology. The words sat on the screen like a warning nobody had wanted to read. If Daniel suspected poisoning before he died, then Margot's death was no longer just suspicious. It was starting to look deliberate. Then we found the final folder: personal notes. Unlike the others, this one wasn't polished. It was messy. Daniel had written entries late at night, probably while exhausted and frightened. Some were only fragments. Black SUV again. Keith met broker. Leora avoided eye contact after finance review. Margot worried but determined. Then one entry made me stop breathing. It was dated 4 days before Margot died. Margot told me she confronted Leora. Leora cried, denied knowing the full scheme, then blamed Keith. Margot did not believe her. I stared at the words. My daughters had spoken before Margot died. Not casually, not as sisters. As accuser and accused, That changed Leora's role completely. She hadn't been unaware. Margot had confronted her. Leora had been given a chance to tell the truth. Instead, she hid behind Keith. Another entry followed the next day. Margot says if Leora helps Keith cover this up, she will report both of them to the board and law enforcement. There it was, motive. Not only for Keith, for Leora too. If Margot exposed the fraud, Keith lost money, power, reputation, and possibly freedom. Leora lost her career, her position, her family trust access, and whatever illusion she still had that she could finally step out of Margot's shadow. The next morning, Detective Reed met us at Lyle's office. We handed over copies of everything. Reed reviewed the insurance documents first. His face hardened almost immediately. This changes things. Enough to arrest him? I asked. Reed shook his head. Not yet. I hated that answer. What more do you need? Proof that he caused her death. He tapped the medical discrepancy file. This gives us reason to reopen the medical side. But motive and preparation are not the same as murder. He was right. I hated that too. By that afternoon, investigators obtained legal authority to request expanded medical review. A forensic pathologist was assigned to re-examine Margot's death certification, hospital records, and available biological samples retained under standard medical procedure. I didn't even know those samples existed until Reed explained it. In sudden deaths, certain samples may be stored temporarily, depending on hospital policy and laboratory processing. It wasn't guaranteed, but if any remained, they could change everything. Waiting for those results felt worse than waiting for anything else. Because if the toxicology review found nothing, Keith could claim everything was grief, coincidence, misunderstanding. If it found something, then my daughter hadn't died naturally. She had been murdered. 2 nights later, while investigators were still waiting, Leora came to my house. She arrived without calling first. I opened the door and found her standing on my porch in the rain, soaked, pale, and shaking. For a second, she looked like the little girl who used to run to me during thunderstorms. Then, I remembered Daniel's notes. Margot had confronted her. Leora had lied. "What are you doing here?" I asked. She looked past me into the house like she was afraid someone had followed her. "I need to talk to you." "About Keith?" She flinched at his name. That told me enough to let her inside. She sat at my kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she never drank. For nearly 5 minutes, she said nothing. Then she whispered, "I didn't know he would go that far." My heart began pounding. Go how far? Tears filled her eyes, but I didn't trust them yet. Not anymore. I thought he only wanted the money. The sentence hit the room like a gunshot. Not because it cleared her, because it condemned her. She had known about the fraud. She had helped. Maybe she hadn't expected murder, but she had chosen the path that led there. I kept my voice steady. "What money, Leora?" She looked down. "The vendor accounts." "How long?" She didn't answer. "How long?" I asked again. Finally, she whispered, 8 months. 8 months. While Margot trusted her. While Daniel investigated. While I believed my family was still intact, Leora had been helping Keith steal from the company. Why? I asked. Her face twisted with bitterness so old it almost looked childish. Because Margot always got everything. There it was. Not justification, not explanation enough, but the wound Keith had used. Leora continued, voice shaking now. "The company, your trust, everyone's respect. I worked there too. I tried too. But no matter what I did, I was always just Margot's little sister." For a moment, I saw the truth. Keith hadn't created Leora's resentment. He had fed it. He had turned old jealousy into cooperation, then into silence, then into complicity. Before I could ask another question, my phone rang. Detective Reed. I answered while Leora watched me with terrified eyes. Reed's voice was controlled, but I heard the tension underneath. "We got preliminary toxicology results." My grip tightened on the phone, and the pause lasted less than a second, but it felt endless. "There are findings consistent with poisoning." I closed my eyes. The room seemed to tilt. Across the table, Leora started crying harder, as if she already knew what the call meant. Reed continued, "We need to talk immediately." I looked at my younger daughter sitting in my kitchen, soaked from the rain, confessing to fraud while my dead daughter's toxicology results confirmed the nightmare none of us wanted to believe. Keith had not just waited for Margot to die. Someone had helped make sure she did. and Leora knew more than she had admitted. The drive to police headquarters felt longer than it actually was. Maybe because I already knew the answer before Detective Reed said it out loud. People don't reopen toxicology reviews unless something is seriously wrong. People don't call emergency meetings at night unless a case has changed. And people don't sound the way Reed sounded when they have good news. When I arrived, he was waiting inside a conference room with 2 homicide detectives, a forensic pathologist, and several binders spread across the table. Nobody smiled. Nobody wasted time. Reed motioned for me to sit. The preliminary toxicology findings are back. My pulse hammered in my ears. Tell me. The forensic pathologist opened a report. We identified traces of a rare cardiac toxin. For several seconds, I couldn't breathe. The words seemed impossible, even though I had been expecting them. Cardiac toxin, not a heart condition, not bad luck. Not a tragic accident. A toxin. Someone had put something into my daughter's body. Are you certain? I asked. The doctor nodded. The concentration was low. That's why it wasn't detected during the initial review. But with expanded testing, the compound is clearly present. Reed leaned forward. Which means Margot did not die from natural causes. Silence filled the room. Months of grief suddenly transformed into something else. Anger. Pure anger. Margot wasn't gone because her heart failed. Margot was gone because somebody wanted her gone. Then the pathologist continued. The toxin would have produced symptoms similar to severe cardiac distress. I immediately remembered Daniel's notes. The symptoms removed from the original medical records. The abdominal pain, the confusion, the dizziness, everything fit. Everything. Reed slid another document toward me. We've also identified who canceled the original toxicology request. My stomach tightened. Who? A hospital administrator. Why? Reed's expression hardened. We're still investigating that, which meant they already suspected corruption. Nobody cancels critical testing in a sudden death case without pressure from somewhere. The question was, who applied that pressure? Then another detective spoke. We checked communications from the days surrounding Margot's death. He opened a file. The administrator received multiple calls from an attorney representing Keith Brennan. Every muscle in my body tightened. There it was. Not proof of murder. Not yet. But another coincidence that wasn't really a coincidence. Keith seemed connected to every missing document, every suspicious decision, every vanished piece of evidence. Reed wasn't finished. There's more. He handed me a financial report recovered from Daniel's records. 3 days before Margot died, Keith withdrew $75,000 from a personal investment account. I frowned. For what? Reed pointed to a highlighted transaction. The money had been transferred to a consulting company already connected to the shell vendors Daniel investigated. The same network, the same people, the same fraud scheme. Then Reed showed me another page. My pulse accelerated immediately. 1 week after Margot's death, the $75,000 had been divided among 3 separate accounts. One of those accounts belonged to the hospital administrator who canceled the toxicology request. The room went silent. Nobody needed to explain the significance. The administrator claimed the payment was consulting income. Investigators believed otherwise. It looked like a payoff, a reward, compensation for helping bury the truth. Then Reed shifted the conversation toward Leora. What exactly did she tell you? I repeated everything from the night before. The fraud, the vendor accounts, the jealousy, the resentment, the admission that she thought Keith only wanted money. Reed listened carefully. Then he asked the question that had been bothering me since she left. Do you believe her? I didn't answer immediately, because the truth was complicated. I believe she knew about the fraud. Reed nodded. And the murder? I stared at the table. I don't know. That was the problem. Leora looked genuinely horrified when I told her about the toxicology results. Either she was a better actress than I ever imagined, or Keith had hidden the worst part from her. Reed seemed to share that opinion. We're bringing her in. As a suspect? As a witness. That distinction mattered, at least for now. The following afternoon, Leora arrived with an attorney. The interview lasted nearly 6 hours. By the time it ended, detectives understood something important. Leora had lied before, repeatedly. She had hidden information. She had helped approve fraudulent vendors. She had protected Keith, yet she remained consistent on one point. She insisted she never knew Margot would be harmed. According to her, Keith told her the fraud would end before anyone discovered it. He promised nobody would get hurt. He promised everything would work out. Reed summarized it later in one sentence. She was willing to help steal. He paused. Murder appears to have crossed her line. Unfortunately for Leora, crossing her line didn't erase what she had already done. Then investigators uncovered the most damaging evidence yet. One of Daniel's hidden spreadsheets contained a timeline. Not financial transactions. Meetings, private meetings, every known interaction between Keith and Margot during the final month of her life. One date immediately stood out. 4 days before Margot died. According to building access records, Keith entered Margot's office after business hours. He remained there for nearly 90 minutes. Security cameras confirmed they were alone. Reed opened another document. We found an email draft. The draft had never been sent. Margot apparently saved it before leaving the office that night. I recognized her writing immediately. Keith threatened me today. He claims I'm destroying the family. He claims I'll regret what happens if I continue. My chest tightened. Margot had documented the threat. She knew she was in danger. Yet she kept going. Reed looked at me carefully. Your daughter was trying to stop him. I nodded. I know. She knew exactly who he was. That realization hurt more than I expected, because it meant Margot spent her final days fighting someone she once loved, someone she trusted enough to marry, someone who ultimately saw her as an obstacle instead of a wife. 3 days later, the case took another major step forward. Investigators executed search warrants on multiple properties connected to Keith. Most yielded nothing important. Then they searched a small storage unit, leased under a business name connected to one of the shell companies. Inside, they found financial records, burned documents, backup phones, and something else. Something nobody expected. A locked metal box. Reed called me personally after it was opened. His voice sounded different, more focused, more certain. We found a journal. My pulse accelerated immediately. Keith's? No. Then whose? Reed paused. Margot's. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Margot had spent months documenting concerns about the fraud scheme, her marriage, and the people around her. Somehow, that journal ended up hidden inside a storage unit connected to Keith's network, which meant someone had stolen it after her death. More importantly, it meant Keith knew exactly how dangerous those pages were. Reed's voice lowered. We're still reviewing everything. Did you find anything important? Another pause followed. Then Reed answered. The final entry was written less than 24 hours before Margot died. My heartbeat exploded. What did it say? Reed exhaled slowly. It names the person she believed was responsible for everything. The room around me seemed to disappear. Months of grief, fraud, lies, murder. All of it had been leading toward this moment. Margot had left the answer behind, and for the first time since her funeral, we were about to hear it in her own words. For months, I had been chasing fragments of my daughter's final days. Emails, financial records, deleted files, witness statements. Every piece revealed part of the truth, but never the whole picture. Now, for the first time, I was about to hear Margot's own account, not filtered through investigators, not interpreted by lawyers. Her words, her thoughts, her final conclusions. Detective Reed arranged for me to review the journal alongside the investigative team. The notebook itself was ordinary, black cover, spiral binding, the kind sold in any office supply store. Yet it contained the most important evidence discovered since Daniel's death. Margot had documented everything: meetings, concerns, financial irregularities, personal observations, names, dates, details. She had been building a record long before anyone realized how dangerous the situation had become. Reed opened to the final section. Start here. I looked down at the page. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, neat, organized, precise. The entry was dated 23 hours before her death. My throat tightened immediately. Reading it felt like hearing her voice again. I no longer believe this is only about stolen money. The sentence hit me hard. Daniel had reached the same conclusion. So had the investigators. The fraud mattered, but it wasn't the real objective. Margot continued. Keith is acting like someone running out of time. I kept reading. Every conversation has become more aggressive, more desperate. He keeps asking whether I intend to involve the board. He knows I have evidence. My hands tightened around the notebook. Keith wasn't surprised by the investigation. He knew about it. He knew Margot was closing in. He knew exposure was coming. Then I reached the next paragraph. Leora admitted enough for me to understand what happened. Not everything, but enough. The room fell silent. This was the first direct confirmation that Margot had confronted her sister. She continued, I believe Leora convinced herself this was harmless. Keith convinced her they were only moving money. I don't think she understands how serious it has become. Reed nodded slowly. That's consistent with her interview. For the first time, Margot's assessment matched what investigators were beginning to believe. Leora wasn't innocent, far from it. But she may not have understood where Keith's path would eventually lead. Then I turned the page and found the entry that changed everything. Margot wrote about a meeting with Keith that occurred the evening before she died. The same meeting referenced in company records. The same meeting that lasted nearly 90 minutes behind closed doors. According to Margot, it started as an argument and ended as a threat. Keith said, I am destroying everything. My pulse accelerated. He said, I don't understand the consequences. I continued reading. When I told him I intended to present the evidence, he stopped denying the fraud. The room went completely silent. That sentence mattered. Until that moment, Keith had always claimed innocence. According to Margot, he privately abandoned that lie. He knew he had been caught. Then came the next line. He said none of this would have happened if I had simply stayed out of it. I felt anger rising in my chest. Keith wasn't sorry. He wasn't ashamed. He blamed Margot for discovering the truth. Reed looked at me carefully. Keep going. I turned the page. The final section was shorter than the others, more emotional, less analytical. Margot's handwriting became slightly uneven, not because she was frightened, because she was exhausted. She had spent months fighting a battle that kept getting worse. Then I reached the final paragraph. I believe Keith is responsible. My heartbeat quickened. I can no longer justify giving him the benefit of the doubt. The next sentence felt like a knife. If something happens to me, investigators should begin with him. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Because Margot had done exactly what victims rarely get the chance to do. She identified the person she believed posed the greatest threat before she died. Then came the final line. The last word she ever wrote in that journal. I never imagined the person I trusted most would become the person I fear most. I closed the notebook. For several seconds, I couldn't breathe. Margot hadn't died wondering who betrayed her. She knew. The woman who spent years building a life with Keith Brennan had finally seen him clearly. Unfortunately, she saw the truth too late. Reed allowed the silence to linger before speaking again. There's something else. My stomach tightened. Every time those words appeared in this investigation, things became worse. Reed opened another folder. The toxicology review is now complete. The room immediately focused on him. The preliminary findings had already indicated poisoning. Now, investigators had the full report. Reed placed the document on the table. The medical examiner officially ruled the death a homicide. Hearing the word out loud felt different. Final. Permanent. Real. Homicide. My daughter hadn't died unexpectedly. She had been murdered. The report concluded that repeated exposure to the toxin over several days likely weakened Margot before the fatal dose was administered. That finding changed everything. This wasn't a spontaneous act. It wasn't a crime of passion. It required planning, patience, intent. Someone had been poisoning her gradually. Reed continued. The toxin was delivered orally. I looked up. Food? Possibly. Drink? Also possible. The investigators still couldn't identify the exact method, but they no longer had any doubt about the cause. Keith's motive was becoming clearer. The means were becoming clearer. The timeline was becoming clearer. Then another detective entered the room, carrying a new report. He handed it directly to Reed. Reed read it silently. His expression changed almost immediately. What happened? I asked. Reed looked up. We got the phone records. Keith's? He nodded. The analysis covered the final week before Margot's death. Most calls were routine, some weren't. During the 48 hours leading up to her death, Keith exchanged multiple calls with a number investigators had been trying to identify for weeks. The number belonged to the hospital administrator, who later canceled the toxicology request. The same administrator who received money connected to Keith's fraud network? The room fell silent. Another coincidence. Another impossible coincidence. Except, nobody believed in coincidences anymore. Reed closed the file. We're preparing an arrest strategy. My pulse accelerated immediately. For months, Keith had hidden behind uncertainty, suspicion, lack of proof. Those protections were disappearing, fast. Then Reed delivered the update that surprised me most. Leora requested another interview. I frowned. Why? Reed's answer came quietly. Because she says she's ready to tell us everything. For the first time since this nightmare began, fear appeared to be winning over loyalty. Leora knew Keith was collapsing. The fraud evidence, Daniel's investigation, the insurance records, the toxicology results, Margot's journal, the walls were closing in. The question was whether Leora would help save herself before they crushed her too. Reed stood and gathered the files. Tomorrow will be important. I looked at the journal one last time before leaving. Margot had spent her final months trying to stop a man she once loved. Daniel had died trying to help her. Now the truth was finally catching up to Keith Brennan. And if Leora really intended to talk, the next 24 hours might destroy whatever remained of his future forever. The morning, Leora agreed to speak again. Nobody knew what to expect. She had already admitted her involvement in the fraud scheme. She had already confirmed that Keith manipulated her and used her access inside the company. But admitting financial misconduct and admitting knowledge of murder were two very different things. Detective Reed warned me not to expect a miracle. People rarely tell the whole truth at once, he said, especially when that truth could destroy their life. He was right. Leora had spent months lying, months protecting Keith, months protecting herself. Trust wasn't something she could earn back in a single interview. Yet, something had changed after the toxicology results. Something had broken. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was fear. Maybe it was the realization that Margot's death was no longer being treated as a tragedy, but as a homicide. Whatever the reason, Leora requested the meeting herself. That alone mattered. The interview began at 9 in the morning. Leora arrived with her attorney, looking exhausted. She had lost weight. Dark circles sat beneath her eyes. For the first time since this nightmare started, she didn't look defensive. She looked defeated. Reed started simply. You asked to speak with us. Leora nodded. I'm tired. Nobody responded. She continued. I'm tired of lying. The room remained silent. Reed understood something important. When people finally decide to tell the truth, the worst thing investigators can do is interrupt them. Leora took a deep breath. Keith didn't recruit me because I was greedy. Her voice shook slightly. He recruited me because he knew exactly what I wanted to hear. The sentence immediately caught my attention. For months, I had been asking why she helped him. Why she risked everything. Why she betrayed her own sister. Now, for the first time, I was finally getting an answer. When did it start? Reed asked. Leora stared at the table before answering. A little over a year before Margot died. She described long conversations with Keith. At first, they seemed harmless. Family complaints, workplace frustrations, casual discussions. Then they became something else. Keith learned exactly where her insecurities lived. He learned which wounds never healed. He learned which resentments she never spoke aloud. And then he started feeding them. He kept telling me the same thing, she said, that nobody ever saw me. I felt my stomach tighten. Because part of that was true, not the way Keith meant it, but true enough to be dangerous, Leora continued. He said I worked just as hard as Margot. He said nobody cared. He said I would always be her shadow. Reed asked the obvious question. Did you believe him? Leora laughed bitterly. I wanted to. The honesty surprised everyone. She wasn't blaming Keith for everything. She wasn't pretending she had no responsibility. She was admitting something uglier. She wanted the lie to be true because it explained years of frustration. Then she described the first fraudulent approval. One vendor recommendation, one signature, one small decision. Keith told her it was temporary, harmless. A way to move money for a short-term tax strategy. She knew it sounded suspicious. She signed anyway. Then came another approval, then another, then another. Every step became easier than the last. Reed listened carefully. When did you realize it was fraud? Leora didn't hesitate. The third month. The room became quiet. That answer mattered. She knew, much earlier than she previously admitted. Why continue? Reed asked. Tears formed in her eyes. Because by then I was trapped. Part of me wanted to reject that explanation immediately. Plenty of people discover they're involved in something wrong and walk away. Yet another part understood how these situations happen. Small compromises become larger compromises. Secrets become leverage. Fear replaces judgment. Keith knew exactly how to create that trap. Then Leora said something none of us expected. Margot tried to save me. I looked up immediately. For the first time during the interview, her voice broke completely. She knew something was wrong. Leora wiped away tears. When she confronted me, she wasn't angry. The statement surprised me. She wasn't? Reed asked. Leora shook her head. She was disappointed. Somehow, that felt worse. Leora described the conversation. Margot showed her documents, vendor records, approval chains, financial transfers. She gave her every opportunity to tell the truth. Every opportunity to walk away. Instead, Leora lied. Again, and again, and again. Why? Reed asked quietly. Leora stared at the floor. Because I was afraid of Keith. The room remained silent. Then she added the part she had never admitted before. And because I was jealous of Margot. There it was. Not greed, not money, not power. Jealousy. Years of it. Decades of it. Not enough to justify betrayal, but enough to explain it. Then Reed shifted the conversation toward the days immediately before Margot's death. Tell us about Keith. Leora closed her eyes for several seconds. When she spoke again, her voice sounded different. Harder. He changed. How? He stopped pretending. The Keith she described wasn't the charming husband everyone knew. He was angry, paranoid, obsessive, constantly worried about what Margot might discover next, constantly asking whether she had contacted the board, whether she had spoken to regulators, whether she had copied documents. He kept saying she was ruining everything. My pulse accelerated. The same phrase appeared in Margot's journal. The same phrase Daniel documented before he died. Keith wasn't just worried. He was unraveling. Then Reed asked the question everyone had been waiting for. Did Keith ever talk about harming Margot? The room fell silent. Leora didn't answer immediately. She looked toward her attorney, then toward the detectives. Finally, she nodded. Once. Very slowly. My heart nearly stopped. When? Reed asked. Leora swallowed hard. 3 days before she died. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The air seemed to disappear from the room. What exactly did he say? Reed asked carefully. Leora's eyes filled with tears again. He said sometimes people become obstacles. My stomach turned. She continued. I thought he meant professionally. I thought he meant removing her from the company somehow. Reed leaned forward. Did he say her name? Another pause. Then Leora whispered the answer. Yes. Silence consumed the room. Keith wasn't speaking generally. He wasn't discussing strategy. He was talking about Margot. Then came the final revelation, the one that changed the investigation forever. The night before Margot died, Leora said, Keith called me. Reed immediately grabbed a pen. What did he say? Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. He told me everything would be over soon. Every detective in the room froze. And? Reed asked. Leora closed her eyes. He sounded relieved. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Because relief is not the emotion a husband feels before losing his wife. Relief is what people feel when a problem is about to disappear. Reed carefully placed his notebook on the table. Is there anything else? Leora nodded slowly. Yes. My pulse accelerated again. She reached into her purse and removed an old smartphone. The device looked worn, forgotten, abandoned. Yet she handled it carefully, like something dangerous. Reed immediately noticed. What's on that phone? For the first time since the interview began, Leora looked directly at him. The reason Keith is going to prison. The room fell completely silent. Then she placed the phone on the table. I recorded him. The old smartphone sat in the center of the interview table like a loaded weapon. Nobody reached for it at first. Not Reed. Not Leora's attorney. not the forensic technician standing near the door. Everyone understood what that phone might mean. For months, Keith had survived by denying everything important. He denied the fraud. He denied threatening Margot. He denied knowing Daniel had evidence. He denied having any reason to harm his wife. If Leora had truly recorded him, all of that could end in a single file. Reed finally spoke. "When did you record him?" Leora kept her eyes on the phone. 2 days after Margot died. My chest tightened. 2 days after, while I was planning a funeral. While employees were crying in hallways. While Keith was already calling lawyers and asking about insurance payouts. "Why?" Reed asked. Leora's answer came quietly. "Because I realized I might be next." That sentence changed the room. For the first time, Leora wasn't trying to appear innocent. She was admitting exactly who she had chosen to stand beside. A man she feared. Reed instructed the technician to document the phone before touching it. Photographs were taken. The device was sealed, tagged, and connected to forensic equipment under controlled conditions. Leora provided the passcode. Her hands shook as she said the numbers aloud. It took nearly 40 minutes before the files were safely copied. Nobody spoke much during that time. I kept looking at Leora, trying to reconcile the woman sitting there with the little girl I once carried on my shoulders during summer parades near the harbor. She had betrayed Margot. She had betrayed me. Yet she looked broken in a way I couldn't easily dismiss. Broken didn't mean innocent. It only meant the consequences had finally reached her. When the technician confirmed the audio was usable, Reed asked whether I wanted to remain in the room. I said yes, before he finished the sentence. He pressed play. At first, there was only background noise, a car engine, rain against glass. Then Keith's voice emerged, clear enough, calm enough, terrifying enough. "You need to stop acting scared," Leora's recorded voice answered, shaky and low. "Margot is dead, Keith." He exhaled sharply. "Exactly. So stop saying her name like she's going to walk through the door." My hands tightened under the table. Reed remained expressionless, but I saw his pen stop moving. Keith continued. "We did what we had to do." The room went completely still. Not one person moved. Leora's recorded voice whispered, "You said she would only get sick." Keith laughed. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a short, cruel sound. "And you believe that?" For a moment, my mind refused to process the words. Then the meaning landed. Leora had known something might happen. She claimed she thought it would be illness, not death. But Keith had known exactly what he was doing. The recording continued. Leora sounded close to crying. "Daniel is asking questions." Keith snapped back immediately. "Daniel is a clerk with a badge. He thinks paperwork makes him brave." My stomach turned. Daniel had been alive when this recording was made. Alive and already in danger. Then Keith said the sentence that sealed his fate. "If he keeps digging, he'll end up where Margot ended up." Reed paused the recording. The silence afterward was heavy enough to feel physical. He looked toward Leora. "You understand what this is?" She nodded, tears sliding down her face. "Yes." He pressed play again. The conversation resumed. Keith was speaking faster now, more irritated than frightened. "You wanted out of her shadow. I gave you that. Don't pretend your hands are clean because you got scared after the hard part." Leora's recorded voice broke. "I never wanted her dead." Keith's answer came immediately. "No, you wanted her gone. There's a difference only people with guilty consciences care about." I closed my eyes. That was the moment Leora's motive became painfully clear. Keith hadn't merely used her access. He had used her deepest resentment and turned it into a weapon. He gave her a story where Margot was the obstacle, where Leora was overlooked, where theft felt like justice. And by the time Leora understood the truth, Daniel was already next. The recording lasted 8 minutes. By the end, Keith had admitted enough to destroy himself. He referenced the toxin without naming it directly. He referenced the hospital administrator. He referenced the insurance claim. He referenced Daniel as a problem that needed to be handled before police started listening. He never gave a formal confession. He never said, "I killed Margot." Men like Keith rarely do. But the meaning was unmistakable. After the audio ended, Reed stood and left the room without explanation. He returned 15 minutes later with an assistant district attorney on speakerphone. Warrants were being prepared. The recording, combined with toxicology, financial records, Margot's journal, Daniel's evidence, insurance records, and the payments to the hospital administrator finally created what investigators had been waiting for. A complete case. Not suspicion, not theory, a case. Keith was arrested the next morning at 6:12 a.m. He was taken from his waterfront condo wearing an expensive robe and the expression of a man who still believed influence could solve consequences. Reporters were not supposed to be there, but news travels fast when a murdered CEO, a dead compliance officer, and a wealthy son-in-law are involved. Cameras captured Keith being led through the lobby in handcuffs. For once, he had nothing prepared to say. No speech about stability, no polished grief, no confident smile, just rage. When a reporter asked whether he killed his wife, he turned toward the cameras and shouted, "This is a family matter." That sentence aired on every local channel by noon. A family matter. As if fraud, poison, and murder were private disagreements to be settled behind closed doors. By afternoon, Leora was formally charged for her role in the fraud scheme and obstruction. She wasn't charged with Margot's murder, not then, because prosecutors believed the evidence showed Keith had hidden the fatal plan from her. But she still lost her job, her position, and whatever trust remained between us. Cooperation reduced nothing emotionally. It only changed what the court might eventually decide. That evening, I went back to Margot's office for the first time since Keith had sat behind her desk. The room had been sealed during parts of the investigation, but Reed allowed me a few minutes. I stood there quietly, looking at the framed harbor photograph she loved, the notebooks stacked neatly beside her computer, the chair Keith had tried to steal before her body was even buried. I thought about Daniel's courage, Leora's weakness, Keith's arrogance, Margot's final journal entry. Then my phone buzzed, a message from Reed, 4 words, "Trial date is set." I stared at the screen for a long time. The arrest was not the ending, not yet. Keith still had lawyers, money, denial. A courtroom would decide what happened next. But for the first time since Margot's funeral, the man who believed he could inherit everything by burying the truth was finally going to answer for what he had done. By the time Keith Brennan's trial began, nearly 11 months had passed since Margot's death. 11 months of investigations. 11 months of subpoenas, forensic reviews, financial audits, and legal battles. 11 months of watching reporters camp outside courthouses while lawyers argued over evidence. Through it all, Keith maintained the same position. He was innocent, a victim, a grieving husband being framed by desperate people trying to explain a tragic death. The story might have worked if the evidence didn't exist. Unfortunately for him, it did. The courtroom was packed on the first day. Journalists filled every available seat. Former employees stood in line hoping to watch. Investors, attorneys, and community members crowded the hallways. The case had become far bigger than a family tragedy. It was now a public story about greed, betrayal, fraud, and murder. Keith entered the courtroom wearing an expensive suit and the same confident expression he had worn during board meetings for years. For a brief moment, I wondered if he actually believed he could win. Then I remembered something Daniel once wrote in his notes. People who lie long enough eventually start believing themselves. Maybe that was what had happened to Keith. Maybe he convinced himself he was smarter than everyone else. If so, he was about to learn how dangerous that mistake could be. The prosecution started with the financial fraud. Not the murder, the fraud. At first, that surprised many people. Later, it made perfect sense. Prosecutors wanted the jury to understand motive before they understood the crime. One forensic accountant spent nearly 2 full days explaining how money moved through the shell companies. Every fake vendor, every fraudulent invoice, every hidden transfer. The evidence was devastating. Charts appeared on large courtroom screens. Bank records connected one account to another. Payment approvals traced directly back to Keith and several of the fraudulent vendors Daniel had identified before his death. By the end of the second day, the jury understood something important. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't poor bookkeeping. It was theft. Organized theft. Millions of dollars moved through a system Keith helped create. The defense tried to argue that Keith merely trusted bad advisors. That explanation collapsed almost immediately. Emails showed Keith personally approving transactions. Internal messages showed him monitoring transfers. Financial records showed him benefiting directly. The jury watched the defense position unravel piece by piece. Then came Daniel's evidence. For me, those were the hardest days of the trial. Daniel wasn't there to tell his story. So prosecutors let his work speak for him. His spreadsheets, his reports, his notes, his warnings. Jurors learned how he discovered the shell companies, how he documented the fraud, how he tracked the money. They learned how he repeatedly warned Margot that Keith was becoming desperate. They learned how he preserved evidence because he feared something might happen to him. The courtroom grew quiet when prosecutors showed Daniel's final note. 3 words. Keith did it. The defense objected immediately. Arguments followed. Legal procedures delayed the presentation for hours. Eventually, the judge allowed limited portions into evidence. The impact was enormous. For the first time, jurors saw the investigation through Daniel's eyes. They saw a man trying to expose the truth before someone silenced him. Then the prosecution shifted focus toward Margot herself. Her journal became one of the most powerful pieces of evidence in the entire case. Prosecutors carefully walked the jury through her entries, her concerns, her discoveries, her growing fear. The final entry received special attention. Several jurors visibly reacted when they heard the last line. I never imagined the person I trusted most would become the person I fear most. Keith stared straight ahead during the reading. He never looked toward the jury. He never looked toward me. Most importantly, he never looked toward Margot's empty seat. Then came the toxicology evidence. The medical examiner explained the toxin, the symptoms, the reason the death originally appeared natural, the reason it escaped detection during the first review. The explanation was technical, but the conclusion was simple. Margot had been poisoned, deliberately, repeatedly. The defense attempted to challenge the science. Independent experts disagreed. The jury watched specialist after specialist confirm the same conclusion. By the end of the testimony, the homicide ruling appeared impossible to dispute. Then prosecutors revealed the payments to the hospital administrator. Financial records showed exactly when the money moved, exactly where it came from, exactly who benefited. The administrator eventually accepted a cooperation agreement and testified personally. His testimony shocked the courtroom. Under oath, he admitted receiving money in exchange for interfering with the toxicology review. When prosecutors asked who arranged the payment, he pointed directly toward Keith. The room became so quiet that even paper movements seemed loud. Keith's attorneys immediately attacked the witness. They called him a liar trying to save himself. Unfortunately for them, bank records confirmed his story. The money existed, the transfers existed, the timing existed. Facts are difficult to cross-examine. By the second week of trial, Keith's confidence had noticeably faded. The smile disappeared. The relaxed posture disappeared. The certainty disappeared. For the first time since Margot died, he looked worried. Truly worried. Then the prosecution played Leora's recording. The courtroom had heard about it for months. Now the jury finally heard it themselves. Every word, every pause, every careless admission. Keith telling Leora to stop being scared. Keith mocking Daniel. Keith discussing Margot's death as though it were a solved problem. Keith warning that Daniel could end up where Margot ended up. When the recording ended, nobody moved. The silence felt overwhelming. Even some reporters stopped taking notes. They simply stared. Because the voice on that recording wasn't the voice of a grieving husband. It was the voice of a man who believed he had already won. The defense spent 3 days trying to explain it away. They claimed context was missing. They claimed emotions were misinterpreted. They claimed Keith was speaking metaphorically. None of it sounded convincing. Not after everything else the jury had already seen. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The prosecution called Leora Garrison to the witness stand. She walked slowly toward the front of the courtroom. The same woman who once helped Keith. The same woman who lied to protect him. The same woman who spent years resenting her sister. Now she was about to testify against him. Keith watched her every step. For the first time since the trial began, I saw genuine panic appear in his eyes, not anger. Panic. Because unlike financial records, unlike emails, unlike toxicology reports, Leora knew the story from the inside. She knew how Keith recruited her. She knew how he manipulated her. She knew what happened before everything collapsed. After taking the oath, she sat down and looked toward the jury. Her voice trembled when the prosecutor asked the first question. Miss Garrison, why are you testifying today? Tears immediately filled her eyes. The courtroom became silent again. Then Leora gave the answer that changed everything. Because my sister deserved the truth. And for the first time since the trial began, Keith Brennan looked like a man who finally understood he was losing. Leora Garrison spent almost 6 hours on the witness stand. By the time she finished, the courtroom no longer saw her as simply a participant in a fraud scheme. They saw exactly how Keith Brennan had built his empire of lies. Piece by piece, person by person, weakness by weakness. The prosecutor didn't rush her testimony. He started at the beginning, her childhood, her relationship with Margot, her years inside the company, her frustration, her resentment, her belief that no matter how hard she worked, she would always stand behind her older sister. Leora didn't try to excuse herself. That was what made her testimony powerful. She admitted the jealousy. She admitted the lies. She admitted helping Keith approve fraudulent vendors. She admitted ignoring warning signs because she wanted to believe the story he sold her. A story where she was finally important. A story where she was finally seen. A story that ended with her sister dead. Several jurors took notes continuously while she spoke. Others simply watched. Keith stared at the defense table most of the time, refusing to look at her. Then the prosecutor asked the question everyone had been waiting for. Did Mr. Brennan ever discuss Margot as an obstacle? Leora swallowed hard. Yes. The room became silent. Multiple times? Yes. What did he say? Tears appeared in her eyes again. He said she was standing in the way of everything. The prosecutor walked slowly toward the jury box. Everything? The company, the money, control. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Because the motive was finally complete. Not greed alone, not jealousy alone, power. Keith wanted what Margot had built. He wanted the authority she earned. He wanted the respect she commanded. Most importantly, he wanted it without Margot standing in his way. Then the prosecution introduced one final piece of evidence. A recovered email chain between Keith and the hospital administrator. The defense had fought desperately to exclude it. They lost. The emails didn't explicitly mention poison. Criminals rarely write things that clearly, but they discussed keeping things simple, avoiding unnecessary reviews, and preventing complications. Combined with the payments, the toxicology interference, and the administrator's testimony, the meaning was obvious. The defense knew it too. Their strategy shifted immediately. No longer trying to prove Keith innocent, now trying to create reasonable doubt. The problem was that doubt requires uncertainty. By this stage, very little uncertainty remained. During cross-examination, Keith's attorney attempted to destroy Leora's credibility. He attacked her role in the fraud, her lies, her cooperation agreement, her jealousy toward Margot. For a moment, it looked effective. Then the attorney made a mistake. You hated your sister, didn't you? Leora stared at him for several seconds. The courtroom waited. Then she quietly answered, No. The attorney pressed harder. You spent years resenting her. Yes. You were jealous of her. Yes. You benefited from the fraud. Yes. He smiled slightly. So why should anyone believe you now? Leora looked toward the jury, then toward me, then toward the empty seat where Margot should have been sitting. When she spoke again, her voice was steady. Because my sister is dead. The courtroom fell silent, and every lie I told helped the man who killed her. Even the defense attorney seemed caught off guard. Leora continued before anyone could interrupt. I was selfish, I was weak, I was jealous. But I did not murder Margot. Keith did. For the first time during the trial, Keith reacted visibly. His jaw tightened. His face reddened, his hands clenched. The mask was finally slipping. Then came closing arguments. The prosecution spent nearly 3 hours rebuilding the entire case from beginning to end. The fraud, the shell companies, Daniel's investigation, Margot's journal, the insurance policy, the toxicology findings, the hospital administrator, the recording, Leora's testimony. Every piece connected. Every piece pointed toward the same person. Keith Brennan. The defense argued that the case relied too heavily on circumstantial evidence, that nobody witnessed the poisoning, that nobody saw Keith administer the toxin. It was their strongest argument. Unfortunately, it wasn't strong enough. Circumstantial evidence becomes powerful when every piece points in the same direction. By the time deliberations began, even reporters covering the trial sensed the outcome. The jury deliberated for less than 8 hours. Less than 8. After 11 months of investigations and 3 weeks of testimony, the decision came quickly. Everyone returned to the courtroom. The atmosphere felt electric. Keith sat motionless beside his attorneys. Leora sat several rows behind the prosecution team. I sat near the front. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Not from fear, from anticipation. The jury entered. The 4 persons stood. The judge asked the question. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor." My heart pounded so hard I could hear it. Then came the words Margot deserved to hear, the words Daniel died trying to uncover, the words that finally ended Keith Brennan's lies. "We find the defendant guilty." Silence. Then another guilty verdict. And another. Fraud. Conspiracy. Obstruction. Witness intimidation. Murder. Guilty. 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 The last illusion of control disappeared from Keith's face. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He simply stared forward as if reality had stopped making sense. Because for years, consequences belonged to other people. Now they belonged to him. Several weeks later, the sentencing hearing arrived. Prosecutors described the damage he caused. A murdered wife, a murdered whistleblower, a stolen company, a destroyed family, financial losses, emotional devastation, lives permanently altered. When the judge finally announced the sentence, the courtroom remained silent. Keith would spend the rest of his life in prison, no possibility of release for decades. The man who wanted control of everything would spend the remainder of his best years controlled by a prison schedule. Then came the most unexpected moment of the entire hearing. Before deputies escorted him away, Keith requested permission to speak. The judge allowed it. Keith slowly stood. For months, he blamed everyone else: Margot, Daniel, Leora, investigators, prosecutors, the media, everyone except himself. Now, for the first time, he looked tired, truly tired. He scanned the courtroom. His eyes briefly found mine, then Leora's. Finally, he looked toward the empty chair representing Margot. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I lost everything." Nobody answered. Nobody needed to, because for once, Keith Brennan had told the truth. He lost the company. He lost his freedom. He lost his money. He lost his reputation. He lost his future. Most importantly, he lost the lie that protected him. Justice had finally caught up to him. But before this story could truly end, there was one more person who deserved justice: Daniel Oakes. The man who saw the truth first. The man who refused to stay silent. The man who paid the highest price for doing the right thing. His final reward was about to become public. 3 weeks after Keith Brennan was sentenced, I stood alone inside the headquarters of Garrison Maritime long after everyone else had gone home. The building was quiet. For the first time in nearly a year, there were no investigators walking through hallways, no reporters waiting outside, no lawyers arguing in conference rooms. The crisis that had consumed our lives was finally over, yet the silence felt strange. When you've spent months fighting for justice, you don't immediately know what to do once you win. I found myself standing outside Margot's old office, looking through the glass wall at the desk she once occupied. So much had changed. So much had been lost. Yet somehow, the company she loved was still standing, and that mattered, because Keith had tried to take everything: the company, the money, the legacy, the future. In the end, he lost all of it. 6 months later, Garrison Maritime held the largest employee gathering in company history. More than 1,000 people attended. Current employees, retirees, community leaders, business partners. Even former staff members traveled across the country to be there. The event wasn't about celebrating a company. It was about honoring the people who saved it. At the center of the headquarters campus stood a newly renovated building overlooking the harbor. Above the entrance, mounted in polished bronze letters, was a name everyone immediately recognized: the Margot Garrison Leadership Center. The applause began before the ceremony even started. Employees stopped to take photographs. Some left flowers near the entrance. Others simply stood quietly, remembering the woman who had changed their lives. Margot would never walk through those doors, but her impact would. Every employee who entered that building in the future would know her story. They would know what integrity looked like. They would know what courage looked like. Most importantly, They would know that she refused to surrender when the truth became inconvenient. Then came the second announcement, one that would have meant just as much to Daniel Oakes. The company officially launched the Daniel Oakes Ethics Scholarship. Funded entirely through assets recovered from the fraud scheme, the program would support students pursuing careers in compliance, corporate accountability, and financial ethics. When Daniel's photograph appeared on the large screen above the stage, the entire audience rose to its feet. The standing ovation lasted nearly 2 minutes. Daniel never wanted attention. He never wanted recognition. He simply wanted the truth. Now hundreds of people were honoring him for exactly that. His sister sat in the front row, crying openly, as employees applauded the brother who gave everything to do the right thing. If there was such a thing as justice after death, that moment came close. The company also announced a new internal policy named the Oakes Protocol. Any employee who reported fraud or unethical conduct would receive direct protection and independent review. No manager could suppress complaints. No executive could hide investigations. Daniel's sacrifice had permanently changed the company for the better. That mattered. It mattered a lot. Later that afternoon, I stepped onto the stage to deliver the final remarks. Public speaking had never frightened me. That day was different. I looked across the crowd and saw people who had lived through the entire nightmare. Employees who attended Margot's funeral, staff members who worked with Daniel, friends who watched our family collapse. They weren't there to hear a corporate speech. They were there for closure. I took a slow breath and looked toward the harbor beyond the glass windows. Then I began. A year ago, I thought I had lost everything. The room became silent. I lost my daughter. I lost trust in people I loved. I lost faith that the truth would ever be fully known. Nobody moved. Nobody looked away. What I learned is that lies can survive for a while. Power can survive for a while. Fear can survive for a while. I paused, but none of them survive forever. The crowd remained completely silent. Margot refused to stay quiet. Daniel refused to stay quiet. Because of them, the truth survived. For a moment, I couldn't continue. The emotions hit harder than I expected. Then I looked toward the front row. Daniel's sister was there. So were dozens of employees who once worked directly for Margot. They weren't mourning anymore. They were proud. This company still stands because good people chose courage over comfort. The applause began before I finished the sentence. It spread through the room like a wave. Hundreds of people standing, hundreds of people clapping, hundreds of people honoring two individuals who never got the chance to see how much their actions mattered. And in that moment, I finally understood something important. Keith had never really understood power. He thought power came from money, titles, control, fear. Margot and Daniel proved otherwise. Real power comes from character. And character outlives everything else. After the ceremony ended, I walked outside alone. The sun was beginning to set over the harbor, the same harbor where I taught Margot how to sail when she was 12. The same harbor she wanted to expand the company around someday. The same harbor she loved until the very end. A familiar voice interrupted my thoughts. "Dad?" I turned and saw Leora standing a few feet away. We hadn't spoken much since the trial. Some wounds need time. Some betrayals don't disappear simply because someone apologizes. Yet she was trying. She had accepted responsibility. She had cooperated fully. She had served her sentence for the fraud-related charges. Most importantly, she stopped blaming everyone else. She looked toward the leadership center. She would have loved this. I nodded. Yes. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then Leora quietly said something that surprised me. I spent years thinking Margot had everything. She looked down. I was wrong. I waited. She wasn't loved because she was successful. Tears filled her eyes. She was successful because she cared about people. It was the most honest thing I had heard from her in years, maybe even ever. We stood there together as the sun disappeared beyond the water, not healed, not completely, but moving forward. Sometimes justice doesn't restore what was lost. Sometimes it simply creates the possibility of a better future. That was enough. Much later that evening, after everyone had gone home, I returned to the harbor one final time. The water was calm. The city lights reflected across the surface. For the first time in over a year, I felt peace. Not because the pain was gone. It wasn't. Losing Margot would always hurt. Missing Daniel would always hurt. But justice had been served. Keith Brennan spent his days behind prison walls, remembered not as a leader but as a murderer. His money was gone, his reputation was gone, his power was gone. Everything he sacrificed his soul to obtain disappeared. Margot's legacy remained. Daniel's courage remained. The truth remained. I looked across the water and remembered something Daniel once wrote in one of his investigation notes. A sentence so simple, I almost overlooked it at the time. The truth takes longer. Standing there beneath the fading light, I finally smiled, because Daniel had been right. The truth did take longer. Much longer. But in the end, it arrived. And when it did, it brought justice with it. The people who chose greed lost everything. The people who chose courage were remembered. The company survived. The truth survived. And so did the legacy of the daughter I loved. The journey had been painful. The cost had been enormous. But the ending was worth it. Because in the end, justice won.